Whether you're an aspiring changemaker or an established leader in the social sector, the essential rules of strategic and sustainable growth don't change. That's what we're going to be exploring today. In this episode, I have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Jack Graham, a UK-born, Brooklyn-based queer social change strategist and writer, and a dear friend. Jack's journey from founding Year Here, an incredible and powerful fellowship for aspiring social entrepreneurs in England, to consulting for nonprofit clients like Giving Tuesday here in the US, is both inspiring and really educational. So in this episode, I've invited Jack to share his experiences and to offer his valuable insights into the nuts and bolts of social entrepreneurship. We break down the essential rules of growth and delve into the practicalities and philosophies of both starting and sustaining social impact. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I'm Richie-Babbage. I've been in the social impact game for 25 years as a social justice lawyer turned two-time nonprofit founder and leader turned growth strategist and coach for leaders around the country. I grew my nonprofit from me and an intern in a tiny closet to a high-impact seven-figure organization. And along the way, I learned so much about how to build an organization that has real impact and how to do it without burning out. In this podcast, I share the nuts and bolts of all of it so you can do that too. We dive into the mindset, strategies, and tactics of how to scale a high-impact organization and how to do it in a way that's truly sustainable. Hi, Jack. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you. I love working with you offline. I have loved getting to know you and your work. And so being able to have this more structured conversation, you have such deep and concrete insight into what it looks like to get a really impactful enterprise off the ground. So I think it's going to be really exciting for my listeners.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. What an intro.
So I want to start by introducing you more formally to my folks. I'm going to read through your bio, and then we're going to dive into the questions. So for those of you listening who are not familiar with Jack as I am, Jack is a UK-born, Brooklyn-based queer social change strategist and writer. In 2012, he founded Year Here, and we're going to get to talk a lot about that here, which I'm really excited about. It was a fellowship for social entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds in London. Over 10 years, the fellowship birthed over 50 new social justice ventures. Today, he works as a strategy consultant for nonprofit clients here in the US, including Giving Tuesday and the Simons Foundation. He's also working on his first book about the radical power of imagination, which I know I'm personally very excited to read when it comes out. So, Jack, this is going to be a great conversation. Lots of mindset stuff and nuts and bolts and strategy. So let's dive in.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So let's start at the top. Year Here. I'm going to be walking through what you did with Year Here and some of the outcomes and your approach to building social enterprises. But what is Year Here?
So in a way, there are two answers to that question because there have been two chapters to Year Here's life. So let me give you chapter one, which is that Year Here was this fellowship program for, aspiring social entrepreneurs, early to mid-career, from lots of different backgrounds. And the idea was we'd give them this very intense one-year program to test and build smart solutions to social problems in their own backyard. This is all back in London, the UK, where I'm from. So it's a bit of a kind of hybrid between a postgrad course, like a master's degree, and an incubator for new social enterprises. We recruited about 40 folks each year in two cohorts, and about half of each graduating cohort would have their own social enterprise idea that they would pursue after the program. And then in 2022, we closed our doors to new fellows after 10 years. And so as of this year, we're kind of redefining ourselves as a movement of 276 entrepreneurs and activists who are tackling...
Which is quite a movement.
It is. It's a decent chunk of people. Yeah. And, a really overwhelming number of them are still focused on social impact. So it just feels like the potential of that group is really huge. So it's a bit more in the kind of mutual aid vein than we had been in the past, more egalitarian, more collaborative, but still resolutely focused on tackling inequality in the UK.
So there's so many reasons that I have wanted to talk to you on this podcast, and so many reasons that I personally just love our collaborations. And you illuminated a few of them. One, your personal deep roots in social change work and social impact work. And two, how you've translated that passion very practically into frameworks and models. And you use the word yourself, intense sort of investment in and building up of enterprises that actually do real work, right? And then have real impact. So this relationship between passion for social change and actually figuring out, okay, what are the things that work? What are the things that don't? Is just, I think, a really wonderful and unique zone of genius that you have. So let's start with why you're here, right? Why did you start it? What need or gap were you filling with that particular model?
Mm-hmm. So I started Year Here back in the early 2010s.
Which is so much longer ago than it feels.
Exactly. I was in my late 20s, which was over a decade ago. And my feeling at the time was that if you were ambitious and driven by social purpose and thoughtful, there weren't that many opportunities for you that really fulfilled those different motivations.
Yeah.
And I'm talking primarily here in the UK context. So, there's public sector roles, and we have lots of these programs that are basically inspired by Teach for America. So Teach First is the
here as well. Yeah.
But lots of other equivalent programs. But essentially in those, you kind of end up being a bit of a cog in the system. Then there are kind of policy roles, think tank roles, academia, which can often feel quite disconnected from the people and the lives that you're thinking about how to improve in some way. Yeah. And then there's the nonprofit sector, right, which is where I had most of my experience, which, to be brutally honest, I had experience as a bit of a kind of backwater. I saw all my friends in different fields, in tech and consulting, and they seemed to be going a lot quicker than I was. And I just kind of looked around in the charities that I was working in, and I didn't really see the people that I aspired to become like. I didn't really have mentors. And so the nonprofit sector didn't feel like it was the place either. So that idea of how could we create a space to learn really fast and think really big about tackling social problems, that was probably the kind of the core of the idea. But then we were very much focused on social enterprise, and that was because there were incubators and accelerator programs at that time, but they all assumed that you already had a great idea, which meant that a lot of those ventures that were in those programs were either based on assumptions about the lives of poor or marginalized or oppressed people, or they kind of solved for like middle class inconveniences. And what they weren't really getting at were the really like unglamorous problems that are hidden away in our societies and get neglected.
Unsexy root causes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And in the UK context, these problems and injustices can be found in places like temporary accommodation hostels for homeless people, understaffed care homes, the criminal justice system. There are like a myriad of issues and problems to be grappled with in those different contexts. But people, who are equipped with the kind of entrepreneurial tools are not there. And so that was another critical thing for us was putting people in those places. And so overall, it was about shining a light on a path towards what we thought was really meaningful social innovation at home rather than thousands of miles away. That's, the here in the name came from my own disillusionment with international development and eventually questioning
sort of
my
shipping
legitimacy.
Off to solve problems somewhere else
that you have no connection to, and you're unlikely to develop your career there. So actually,
it's the savior complex.
Right. So there was very much the antithesis of that, and I think what we did really well was with our storytelling, because we were asking people to quit their job and do this program that was like really hard to explain to your friends and family, and then pursue social entrepreneurship, which even today, most people have not heard of. So all these very unknown, risky feeling things. And a lot of that, I think we had to tell a really strong story about why that did fulfill their driver, their motivational drivers, which I think it did. So that was probably something that I think we did do very well, if I say so myself.
Well, yes, you did. And we're going to talk in a moment about some of the exciting enterprises that were birthed. But you mentioned sort of being able to tell a story about why taking this risk, why now, why here. And I would imagine that the institutions that you helped to birth, or I should say the people that you worked with and supported, had different versions of that, but that there was a through line or some through lines that you saw. What were some of the through lines that helped them explain to others, why am I leaving my, safe job with health benefits to do this thing that nobody really understands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I often describe myself as someone who's like constantly looking for the best vehicle for social progress. I'm like still looking, and maybe there isn't one, but I'm going to keep looking. And so
I'll keep you posted if I find it.
So my career, we don't have time to go through my whole career journey, but it's been like a series of pivots where I've kind of gone all the way down one lane and thought like, oh no, this is broken, this doesn't make any sense or whatever, or this is problematic in some way, and then shifted. And probably the one that had been most recent for me and was most present in Year Here's storytelling was around social enterprise as opposed to charity. So, and just to give you one little anecdote from my own experience. So I used to work in international development, as I mentioned, and I was working for an HIV and AIDS NGO in Zambia. One of our funders was, very bizarrely, was the development agency of the government of Liechtenstein, a tiny European country, which I feel like I had definitely forgotten existed as a country, but it exists. There's like 60,000 people in some
mountains. And they are funding international development work, it turns out.
So they are. And their Southern African representative came to like inspect our budget for the next year. And I was the budget person. So she and I met. And you're probably familiar with this, but particularly in international development, there is this allergy to overheads. And so our overheads
here as well. The huge
cost had to be under 10%. And so she literally stood over me while I was in Excel and asked me to told me to add additional delivery costs that we did not need. So things like T-shirts to bulk up our delivery costs. It was just maddening. See, you're asking me to spend more of Liechtenstein taxpayers' money to add no more value, but just to meet this arbitrary target that someone set thousands of miles away that has no idea what operational delivery looks like on the ground. So for me, that was my part of my massive frustration with the charity model that moved me into social enterprise. And even a lot of our fellows, they came to us usually late 20s, early 30s, so they'd had some career before. Many of them would have come from mainstream charity and had that similar frustration. Or others might have been outside or maybe been involved in side projects and seen some of that already. So I think that was part of it, was like, this could be a place where you could kind of fuse entrepreneurship with your desire to tackle inequity and injustice in society. And you're kind of respecting and valuing both parts of yourself in that way. So I think that was one of the threads that really spoke to people.
One thing that I want to lift up and reflect back that I am hearing, that I actually feel like, and you and I have talked about this a little bit offline, I am excited about now that we're, it isn't 2012, and I think we're moving in the right direction in this way. There have definitely been times in the past where if you wanted to do social impact work, you had to do it in a particular way. Right? Mm-hmm. There was what you're calling the charity model. It's the sort of traditional nonprofit model, right? And when I was coming up, if you wanted to do mission-based work, you had to start a nonprofit, a 501c3. Mm-hmm. Right? And maybe you could do a mission-based, sort of a mission-centered, you could have a mission-centered company, but there weren't even B Corps here in the States when I started. So this idea of doing good work, of doing social change work, meant one thing. And what I hear you talking about, and one of the reasons I was so excited to learn about Year Here and to dig into the model, is that definitely at the time, this idea of social enterprise, of bringing together strands of learning and expertise and working models from different sectors bringing them together into this hybrid of let's just do what works, right? If we want to change and bring about a transformation in this population or this community, we don't have to be stuck in this one model. Let's draw from this model and take from that sector and take from academia and take from all of these things and just do the shit that works, right? Mm-hmm. And now, fast forward more than a decade, I do think that the social impact space is becoming less siloed, right? That you can talk about being a 501c3 or a nonprofit or a charity or a social enterprise or a hybrid or a mission-based organization or a mutual aid group, that this conversation about let's identify what works and just do that thing is separating itself from, and what is the corporate structure that you're setting up. And you started having that conversation in a really practical way, a decade ago, more than a decade ago. And I think I just want to highlight that, because for folks listening who are in the sort of early stages of growing, or the stages of growing an organization, one of the key learnings here is focus on doing what works, not on the model, right? Not on what we call the model. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I do think it's also something that I find frustrating, because if you or I had been the kind of people who were just straight up commercial entrepreneurs, then right. The model, the legal structure, the model, everything would have been very clear for us, because thousands of others have followed that same track.
Yes.
But if you are driven by social purpose, and starting your career and you're ambitious at this point in the 2020s, then you actually, to your point, you have a range of different routes you could take, which is kind of frustrating, because actually it's necessary thinking that you have to do, like, which vehicle are we going to go for? They all have different dynamics. You might not choose the right one on the first iteration. And that actually it's just a different intellectual challenge than, like, how can we make a thing that actually works in terms of the social issue that we're trying to tackle. So it's frustrating, and it's interesting. The dynamics are slightly different between the US and the UK. I think the UK has a more thriving social enterprise field, but I think the US has much more in the kind of community organizing and political organizing space than we do.
Absolutely.
So particularly with 501c4s. But the 501c3 bit, I think the dynamics are very comparable between the two countries. But that kind of deciding what model you're going to be so early on is like a really tough decision for people to have to make.
Yeah. And I think you're right. There is a complexity there. So what were some of the really exciting enterprises that came out of the program? I want to dive into the model, but I love spending time on the website. I know there were just so many incredible, just to give folks an idea of what we're talking about, the outcomes. Yeah.
Let me give you two, and one speaks more to lived experience, and the other is more about kind of gathering insight from the ground up, both of which are really key tenets of our philosophy. So the first is Chatterbox, which was founded by a 2015 fellow, Masal Hedayat. So Masal was a refugee from Afghanistan, came to the UK, and she saw her own mother, who was a civil engineer back home in Afghanistan, become a cleaner when she came to the UK. And so this underemployment of refugees is very common. The qualifications don't carry across to this new country, etc. So skipping forward to 2015, when Masal founded Chatterbox, Chatterbox is now a language tuition company that's staffed by refugees.
Wow.
So it's aiming to tackle the unemployment and underemployment that often affects refugees by employing them as language tutors. So you can learn Swahili or Arabic or French from a refugee. And now Chatterbox is doing incredibly well. They're on the more commercial end of our portfolio, so have raised venture capital money, for example.
Oh, interesting.
And they have lots of corporate clients, like the Red Cross, Microsoft, and Unilever, some of their clients. So that would be one. And then another one in a very different domain, which is in health, is called APT. Apt Health. And so this is founded by a 2016 fellow, Hector Smethurst, who was placed as part of the Year Here program in a doctor's surgery in Bow, which is East London, one of the most deprived and diverse boroughs of London. And one of his roles was to try to get patients to come in to get screened for diseases and manage existing conditions. And that it was very kind of mundane, involved writing and sending letters, making phone calls, scheduling appointments, and their success rate was actually very low. So he started toying around with different ways of getting that rate up. So initially, just very crudely, he just switched the system to text messaging, and the response rate immediately improved. More people were booking in. They found that when people came in, what had happened was the non-English speaking patients would have passed their phone to their English speaking children to translate.
Wow.
And all of this might seem very trivial, but just one lost percentage point in uptake for preventative care services can actually result in lives lost. So uptake of health services is skewed towards those who speak English as a first language, who are better educated, who are wealthier. So who gets to make their healthcare appointment isn't just some like administrative niggle. It's a serious social justice issue. And so what Apt Health is now is actually a tech service offered to GP surgeries across the country to boost uptake of preventative care services. So they now use behavioral science and AI to combat misconceptions and myths, which vulnerable patients like the ones in Bow, but also across the country, are more susceptible to, in order to boost uptake of preventative healthcare appointments across the country.
So I want to draw a sort of through line between those two experiences. And thank you for sharing those enterprises. They're great. And I will share in the show notes links to those organizations. So few key takeaways here. One, both are examples of the sort of notching up from lived experience, right? And I think especially over the last, say, 5 to 8 years here in the States, there's been thankfully more of a focus on centering the sort of authentic expertise of people with lived experience, particularly as leaders of social impact organizations and institutions. And I love that those are both very concrete examples of, we don't just mean take somebody who had a particular life experience and put them at the head of a nonprofit, right? That the lived experiences actually gives insight into the nature of the problem, solutions that haven't worked, et cetera. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to highlight, particularly for the first that you mentioned, Chatterbox, is thinking about revenue from different sources. And so even if you are a traditional 501c3, thinking about partnerships with corporations, thinking about investments, you mentioned venture capital, which is easier if you are a hybrid or other kinds of corporate structures, but earned revenue and thinking creatively about ways to bring money in beyond just donations and grants from foundations is really powerful. And I love that you mentioned that. So I wanted to highlight those. And then the third is you've used this word a few times, mundane, which I love. I really love it. In the business context, and I talk with a lot of my sort of female entrepreneur friends who talk about boring businesses and how everybody wants like a sexy, we're going to be the next, I don't know, something really exciting and totally different that nobody's ever heard of. And actually that's not really a thing. And I think in social entrepreneurship in particular, this idea of what's the next innovation, what's the next thing that nobody's thought of. But when you really look at impact and social change, it's about drilling down on models that have already worked, maybe in other sectors, maybe in other ways. And it's about doing the boring, mundane things that you find that work at scale. And so this idea of shifting from, paper to text, or really saying, how do we get this uptick of 1%? Right? That might not seem exciting and sexy, but that's the impact. That's the work. So I really love that you shared those examples because I think they highlight really important lessons for social entrepreneurs
and
leaders.
Yeah, 100%.
So you've been doing this work for a long time, as we talked about in the weeds, and I want to drill down on some of the specifics. And I want to start with the year here process, or you called it the methodology, because I think over the years of running year here, you did have an opportunity to start to see what worked, what didn't, what led to success, et cetera. So if you'll start by walking us through the methodology that you mentioned, because I feel like you really got it dialed in, and it's something that people, even without going through an incubator program, can learn from.
Totally. So, having delivered it, I think 16 times in the end, we had lots of time, lots of chance to
amazing.
iterate and improve.
Right.
So in a nutshell, there were 3 phases. The first and the longest was a frontline placement. And this is where, excuse me, in fact, let me just start that again. Can you just tee me up for that question again? Sorry. Are you on mute?
I was writing the time, so the editor knows.
Oh, sorry.
24. Okay. And we're going to start here. Here we go. So you've been doing this work for a long time in the weeds, learning and refining and executing on what works over more than a decade. And I think that founders and honestly leaders of organizations that want to grow strategically and sustainably can learn so much about what works and what doesn't from the methodology that you honed at year here. So I want to start there. Will you walk us through your process, or what you call your methodology? Because it was both rigorous and I think pretty dialed in by the end, right? What worked, what didn't. So let's start there.
Yeah, of course. So big picture, there were 3 phases to the program. The first was the longest, was the frontline placements. This is where our fellows were placed in quite gritty, unglamorous frontline public and social services, like pupil referral units, which is where kids who are expelled from mainstream education go in the UK, like prisons, like care homes for older people, like temporary accommodation. And within that, they were charged with coming up with an innovation project to drive impact within that context, but also primarily just to kind of listen and learn. Second phase was a consulting project, and this is where they were working in teams with us as the team, the year team, and our faculty as well, delivering to briefs set by usually larger organizations, so housing associations, national charities, central and local government, against specific social innovation briefs. And then the third and final phase was the Venture Lab, which is where they were challenged to come up with their own social enterprise idea, fueled by the insight and that they had gathered through the first 2 phases. And so those are the 3 headline phases. And then woven through all of that was mentorship. We had these 5 very intensive training weeks, which we call boot camp weeks. We had off-the-record speaker sessions. We had a personal development retreat in the wild. So lots of different elements, very, very intense. And then after the program, if they chose to carry on with their venture, which was, as I mentioned, was about half, then we'd provide an incubator program for another 3 months after graduation.
So why those, right? I hear the 3 phases and then the through lines of mentorship and expanding your network. How did you zero in on those particular phases and elements as being really important?
Good question. So I think firstly, I would say whenever I talk through that, I'm like, wow, that's a lot. It was undoubtedly intense. And I think that intensity was important, and there was a strong rationale for that, which is if you think about how we train our doctors or our lawyers or our architects, they spend the best part of 10 years learning before they are let loose in the real world. But in nonprofits, you just kind of throw in and expect to know how to do it, which is really wrongheaded, because this stuff, I think, is some of the hardest things that you can choose to do with your career. And so the intensity was to reflect the fact that there is a lot to learn. The other thing I think for us is a kind of educational philosophy was that this was not about learning in a lecture hall. This is about learning in the real world. And I think that there is no growth or learning without the prospect of failure, of real failure. Right. it's just learning in the real world is just so much richer than learning in a lecture hall. Obviously, you then have to think very carefully about the fact then what does failure mean if you're working with vulnerable people, and that needs
what
to
are the implications and consequences of that? Absolutely.
So as long as you can get that balance right, I think that's the way that we should be preparing our next generation of social innovators. So, but in answer to your question around the different phases, so placement was absolutely about insight. I think that so often policies and programs are designed by people in fancy buildings with post-it notes and zero human connection to the people that they're trying to think about, whether that is people without housing, whether that's people in food poverty or whatever the social issue is. And so for us, it just, solving social challenges has to start with understanding them at a really human level. And also this phrase that we'd always talk about is that social change happens with people, not to them, for them, or at them.
I love that.
And so super important that the very first thing and the longest thing that they did within this program was go into a care home or a homeless hostel and be useful and just be a friend and a partner to people who are living through tough realities. And that's your foundation for anything that comes after. The consulting phase, much more about systemic understanding and starting to understand how does local government work and how does that interface with these different institutions and the market as well. So one of the differences I've noticed between the US and the UK is the UK has a much more public sector procurement of social enterprises.
Interesting.
So a lot more public services are actually delivered by independent nonprofits that might have a social enterprise model and win government contracts, which seems to happen a bit less here. So
it actually happens pretty often. The problem is that government contracts are very, very hard to manage. Mm-hmm. And so you have a lot of the smaller frontline organizations that do have the most intimate understanding of and connection to the communities and the work. They can't win the contracts or manage the contracts because it's so complex. So a lot of public services are delivered through nonprofits, but they're the bigger health, education, nonprofits. And we have connect.
We have some of the same dynamics, unfortunately, in the UK. Yeah. But it's a big, particularly in health, it's a big health market really for nonprofits to sell their services. And then finally, the Venture Lab, the idea there is really around prototyping, which is quite a simple idea, really just like try things before you launch them, like test them before you launch, which is completely common sense, but actually is not commonplace. And so that was every single week we'd be pushing folks to get out there and try this idea again and test it. So those are the rationale. And then the incubator that we added that on after a few cohorts, just because we felt a little bit like we were kind of pushing people off the cliff because we had them stress test this idea, but it takes a lot to launch a new institution. And so we wanted to just go that one step further forward and give them a little bit of a helping hand to keep moving on. Almost all of them will then go on to some other accelerator program or another incubator program because you're going to still need help. It's really hard. So we would often be handing over to other incubators and accelerators, but we did add that incubator in ourselves just to give people the best possible platform.
So I want to just pause for a moment because it dawns on me, and this has dawned on me a number of times in working with you, that as you are describing guiding and supporting founders and social change leaders through this process, you are actually building an institution, right? Year Here was also a startup, was also learning and growing and failing in public and doing all of the things that you're talking about. And I just think that that's such an interesting, almost meta thing that was happening. How did your own experience as a social impact founder inform what you were telling the leaders you were working with and your faculty? And, if you don't mind sharing, how far ahead did you feel like you were, or were you sort of let's just all try it and see what happens this year,
I think that it was an asset. And actually, I sometimes wonder whether some of the earlier cohorts were a more profound learning experience because I was closer to their reality. In terms of, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And I was, especially the very first cohort. I mean, I don't even know what's happening next week. And I've got to pretend to you that like this whole year's been mapped out. It's all perfect. I'm like, I don't know how the salary is going to get paid this month. So yes, very much, what's that phrase? Building the plane as you're flying it.
That's right.
It was very much that, which, I think was, I decided quite early on that I was going to be honest. I was vulnerable with the fellows about where I was at. My own personal, when I first took that step towards starting year here, I actually had like debilitating anxiety. This is like 12, 13 years ago. And I was open about that. And I think, and that vulnerability, it wasn't just about me, but it was also, we had like an intellectual vulnerability as well, because we said like, we have people in our faculty that would approach the problems that you're faced with in completely different ways. And they're going to pull you off in really different directions. And that is intentional because you as the individual need to decide like, what kind of entrepreneur do I want to be? What kind of innovator do I want to be? Which tools am I going to put in my toolkit? Which ones am I not so comfortable with? What's my personal philosophy? Because the world is complex and we can't be your parent, and you are here to work out what kind of leader you want to be. And therefore, I just think it's really important to treat people like adults, and not, I've joked about hiding how unprepared I was. But in general, I would err towards being open about like, this is the reality of where I am, because I think that can be instructive and maybe even, dare I say, like inspiring to people.
And I'm going to go even farther than I think. I think it is, right? I think that one of the worst things we can do as leaders, and having been a founder myself, also sort of building the plane as I flew it multiple times, even now building my business, right? This idea that when you can do something that feels exactly right, feels totally safe, you know exactly what's going to happen, and everything works out, like that's the definition of leadership success, or that's when you know you're doing a good job. That's never happened in the history of ever. For me, for any leader that I've ever talked to who has actually created impact, you're always at your growth edge. You're always asking the next question and trying something just a little bit before you're ready. And so being honest about that is the only way that this works. And so the thing I was going to do before I highlighted, wait, you're doing the same thing, is I hear a few lessons that I want to lift up. But now, having heard you reflect on your own sort of meta experience, I see the influence of your co-leading alongside them, co-building alongside them in your model, right? This vulnerability, this emphasis on intentionality from the beginning, right? There is a structure to what we're doing. It isn't throwing spaghetti against the wall, right? The iteration, let's try it, then go back and reflect, and then try it. The listening and the emphasis on listening. I mean, the sort of intimate understanding of the problem and the community and the levers that comes from phase one, and even the consulting project part is all rooted in listening and not making assumptions and challenging your own narratives and beliefs and things. And I think all of those elements are very powerful parts of growing an impactful institution. And I see how they grew out of your own experience, right? You were doing that at the same time. So it is not a surprise to me that those are the phases that you came up with. Okay. So I would say that a lot of the questions that I get from the leaders that I work with that are growing their ventures, right? Some are early stage, some are not, but they want to grow. There's some inflection point that they're at. Everything feels critical. Everything feels important. How would you advise people, or actually I'm going to get even more concrete. What are two things that you would recommend an early stage venture prioritize if they had to focus on two things to get them, say, through those first 3 years or that first growth phase? Because everything feels like it's critical, but not everything can be critical.
Yeah, totally. I think that in my mind, I saw it as an equation where you're trying to figure out two things at once. Maybe it's like a quadratic equation. I don't know. It's been too long since I've done math. But like, on the one hand, you're figuring out what in nonprofit jargon is your theory of change. Like, does it actually work? You're aiming to, I don't know what it is, reduce levels of obesity or whatever. Like, does the thing actually, is it actually effective? In tech bro jargon, it's like your product solution fit. Then the other side of the equation for me was always about the business model. So how can you do what you want to do while covering all your costs? Again, the commercial entrepreneurship jargon is product market fit there. And in commercial business, often both sides of that equation is actually one and the same. So if you're like a coffee shop, you want to meet people's need for caffeination in delicious beverages, and you do that well, people pay you for it, your business model thrives.
They balance, they equal.
Right. That's reductive, of course, but you get my point. Like, unfortunately, in social enterprise and in nonprofits, it's rare that your impact model and your business model are in lockstep. So it's like two concurrent equations that you're trying to solve. And I think you just got to always be sure that every quarter or every month you are making progress towards getting to a more robust answer to both those questions of like, how are we going to solve the problem that we set out to solve? And how are we going to cover our costs while doing it?
Pay for it. Yes.
And like they're very, very, very simple questions, but like within that, I think there's a bunch of sub questions. For me, on the former, on the impact model, as you can tell, I lean very strongly towards like really deeply understanding your problem. And I think the solution part will flow much easier the more you invest in really deeply understanding your problem. This one, we had a faculty member once who asked this question: what is your unique understanding of the problem that means that you'll succeed where others have failed? So pretty much every nonprofit under the sun is working on a problem that some other nonprofit is working on, right? So clearly that means that collectively we haven't succeeded in getting rid of that problem. Therefore, something must be up in their analysis to suggest that we haven't made it, right? So like you need to have some originality in your understanding of the problem to be able to come at it from a new angle and actually genuinely make a dent or shift the needle in the right direction. And I think also, particularly in the early years, focusing more on qual rather than quant. So the charity sector, nonprofit sector pushes us towards KPIs and impact measurement, but actually some of the real insight, the real nuggets of insight, I think often come from qualitative observations, anecdotal evidence that can just like illuminate, oh, hang on, this thing is happening for this, member of our community that could actually be replicated at scale in a really effective way. Often it's those qualitative insights that give you the clue for where the impact might really lie.
I think that this idea of the equation balancing, and I love sort of picturing the equation just because the Virgo in me wants everything to make sense and be structured. But this idea of sort of theory of change, right? What is the unique relationship between the mission, the change you're trying to bring about, and the strategies you're going to use? Like, is that working? And then how are we going to pay for it? Right? There's so many different ways you can talk about that equation. You can talk about product market fit and business model. You can talk about your strategic vision for change and the budget that will fund that vision, right? So there are all of these different ways. What I think is really important in a social enterprise or a social impact model, as opposed to a for-profit model, again, being a little reductive, is that the better you are at not just understanding part one of the equation, the theory of change, and how what you're doing is actually going to have impact, but the better you are at articulating it, the better you will be at bringing in money to support it. And I think very often, and this was definitely the case for me, so I can speak from experience, I saw those two parts of that equation. I saw how they connected in the for-profit world. And so my narrative was, but in the nonprofit world, they're separate, right? So we're doing our work over here, but nobody's going to pay us for the work. Somehow I have to convince these people over here in part two of the equation, right, to be investors. But actually, it's still the same equation. We're not asking for a quid pro quo, right? It isn't, I do this and you give me $5, like for coffee, or $10, as the case may be. It's, here's the vision we're creating. Here's why it's important. Here's how we believe we're going to bring that about. That's the theory of change work. And then the right people who are excited about that vision, who believe in that vision, who want to be part of that change will raise their hand and say, I want in, right? I want to be part of that. And that's your donors and that's your supporters. So it's still that what happens in part A must balance with and equal what is happening in part B. It's just that the method, the bridge between those two is perhaps different. It isn't quite as transactional. It's more relational.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about priorities. What's the converse? I would also say that in this throwing spaghetti against the wall world of growth, there are things that are distractions that feel important that I'm not going to say aren't important. I will say they are distractions from the priorities, right? They are things that you can spend a lot of time and money and energy on that actually aren't going to allow you to scale sustainably. They're not going to be really high ROI. In your experience, what have you seen as some of the most critical and dangerous, maybe even common distractions in the growth phase? Yeah. And I know this obviously differs, but I feel like there's probably some through lines.
No, 100%. I would say, as weird an answer as this might sound, success, quote unquote. So, and I put it in quotations because I'm talking more here about like vanity metrics. So once you start, I think people are often quite surprised about how easy it is to gain momentum with little startup grants and awards and press attention.
Oh yeah.
And you kind of get a bit of validation, which by the way, as an entrepreneur, you really need, right? Because it can be very lonely and scary.
And you're just like, I'm failing.
And you're like, okay, great. Someone said it's a good thing. I'll keep going. But real talk, it's not really moving you forward, right? Like often those grants are tiny and the awards are nice, but they don't really help you move forward. And, you know, in terms of those two, the two equations, it's not helping you move towards a business model that consistently turns a profit over the long term, nor is it moving you towards an impact model that actually works. And what I have found in my experience with the Year Here Fellows is that once you are rolling, it's very hard to hit pause to then work on those fundamentals. It's far easier to find the right business model when you're small and nimble, kind of before you come out to party with the world. And so when you have quite a low cost base. And there is this startup guru, Steve Blank, who defines a startup as a temporary organization, which I think is really key. So it's like a startup is not just a smaller version of the final organization. It is it's a temporary state. And it's like, it's an experiment. It is defined as the search for a viable business model. And I think that's a really useful reframing.
I love that.
So,
because it gives you permission to try to experiment, fail.
And but you have to have the belief that like when you are ready, when you have done the internal work of like, okay, I think we've got our impact model sorted. I think we've got our business model tight. Now we're ready to go out. When you're ready, the awards, the accolades, the funding, the press will be there. But make sure that you are ready. Because I have seen a lot of ventures it just sounds like a great idea. So they get lots of attention, maybe some funding, but they never fix the underlying machinery. And so therefore 3 or 4 years in, they're like, we're in over our heads. We now have 20 staff. we can't afford to pay them all the time. It's not quite working. The press has now dried up because they've got bored of us. So, just having faith that you should be focusing on the unglamorous, mundane, behind the scenes questions as opposed to the showy out front stuff.
I love that. That's so right. I'm just like, you people can't see because we're on a podcast, but I'm like nodding a lot. So I want to wrap up with just a couple sort of personal insight questions for you about your experience. So we've talked about the sort of nuts and bolts and the tactical and strategic pieces. And I want to sort of notch up to some more generative thinking. What along your journey would you say, if any, are misgivings that you have about the social enterprise model? Because I know your experience is mostly in that particular model. We've talked a bit about how it blends, but what have you learned that perhaps doesn't work?
Oh, a lot. So I think a lot of my misgivings stem from the fact that social enterprise and social entrepreneurship is really explicitly modeled on commercial entrepreneurship. And we don't even copy and paste that well because like in commercial for-profit entrepreneurship, there's a big pot of gold at the end, which we don't get. So there's a whole bunch of things within that. There's this focus on like heropreneurship, so like single founder, which I think is bullshit. Yep. We know that, most of the most successful social movements and social innovations were led by groups of people, not individuals. Yep. There's this thing that we've kind of skirted around, like ideas that sound like good ideas, but really aren't. Yep. Like a lot of those social enterprise ideas that start with like, what if, I always do an American accent, what if we could take food waste from high-end restaurants and give it to, insert vulnerable group? They kind of sound cute, but they are bad ideas. Actually, to name and shame, a good example of that is Tom's Shoes, the buy one, give one. The original buy one, give one model. Yeah. There was a bunch of evidence to suggest that was actually stifling the like indigenous footwear market in West Africa. So perfect example of like, great intentions, but you're actually making the situation worse. Yeah. Then I think there's also this kind of the impact measurement, KPI culture, which I think a lot of that comes from basically bankers who are like, we have dollars and we are very clear, dollars and cents, like those are our numbers. That's what we focus 100% of our attention on. And you guys in social impact, it's all messy and confusing. So therefore, we're going to impose the system on you. And it's like, actually...
You measure impact in happy feelings and rainbows.
Can you put a decimal point on exactly how happy your beneficiaries are? And like the world doesn't change in linear ways, right? With those tangible outputs and measurable outcomes. I once saw a talk of the Harvard professor Mark Moore, and he was talking about the civil rights movement, saying like arguably that's the most effective social innovation of all time. And do you think anyone was like counting the placards or like measuring the the decibels of people's cries for freedom? Yes. No. Yeah. So I think a lot of that is wrong-headed, and it's just like we've copied and pasted from commercial for-profit land. I think there's also a broader critique. There's been a lot written about this, about where social enterprise is kind of the stooge of neoliberalism. So we can enable bad actors to like fund social enterprises to therefore offset their own, what they would call negative externalities. Really, it would be better if they just can they just stop polluting and start paying their taxes and pay their people properly? That would be far better than all of their social enterprise investment combined. And also from the public sector, this point about public sector procurement, it can be about passing the buck, passing accountability, like out of government. It's kind of the privatization of progress.
Of social and public goods, absolutely.
Right, which is not cool. And I think there's a big issue around accessibility. So like figuring out your model, as we've talked about, takes time, and time costs money. And funders and investors in this space, I think, are not patient enough. So they give like these micro grants, certainly in the UK, 2,000 or 3,000. I'm like, what can you do with that?
That's right. For 1 year. And it's only, if you hit certain targets. Yeah, it's not.
Right. Yeah. Right. So plus the aversion to overhead we've talked about. And so eventually it seems like it becomes only possible if you have some kind of private wealth, which is like utterly bonkers that we would have a system that perpetuates the very inequality that we profess to care so much about. Yeah. And you even have people who kind of proudly declare like, oh, I don't pay myself anything, as if they're a martyr.
Oh my God. We could do a whole podcast about how that makes my head explode. Yeah.
100%. People need to get paid, and that's okay. That doesn't make them like evil capitalists.
It's not just okay. Like the idea of martyring ourselves for social good is so backwards. Yeah.
100%. Yes. And it means that only a certain kind of person gets to have access to this opportunity. So, yes, lots of misgivings.
I was going to say, and I would imagine that some of those have come from just your own personal learnings and lessons. So what have your personal biggest lessons been? Mm-hmm. Going back to this idea of, you've been sort of supporting social enterprises and sort of the lessons you've learned about social enterprise. And then at the same time, having this own meta experience of social entrepreneurship yourself. What are your biggest lessons from your own personal, entrepreneurial experience?
Well, I mean, to close out that last point, I feel like in summary, like the vehicle is just that. It's just a vehicle, right? So it doesn't guarantee success. You still need to engage your critical functions to build something great. And with Year Here, I mean, there are bits that I'm really proud of and other bits where I'm like, oh, damn, I should have done that better. So maybe
that's always
like 5, 7 out of 10, who knows?
Yeah.
But I would say some of the big ones that stick with me, simplify the business model. So our business model is very complex, and you and I have talked about this before, but there's this like mantra of diversifying your revenue streams, and I don't know whether I align with that.
Yeah, we've talked about that. We've gone back and forth about that.
We had like very, very diversified revenue streams. We had lots of different income sources, and for each one, you have your own sales pipeline. Loads of different relationships, infrastructure for each different. I was essentially running like 5 or 6 business models layered on top of each other, which I wish I hadn't done because it's complicated and like there's always one of them that's going wrong at any one time. But I would also have just raised more money up front. So raising startup cash is different in my mind to your ultimate business model. Yeah. I think there is money to be had that's for like, I'm starting a thing. And it's a social thing. Can I have some money to do that? I would have tried to raise.
That's what I did. That was not on purpose. I just happened to be able to do that, and it gave me some spaciousness to do a lot of what we've talked about. To listen, to be in community with people. I probably my journey would have been very different had I not had that spaciousness.
100%. And I think that again, this relates to like who are you as the entrepreneur to be raising that money?
That's right.
I don't know about you, but I certainly felt like some imposter syndrome and some like, am I really going to ask this person for 50,000 or whatever? And like, if I could go back and tell myself, I'd just whisper in the ear, like, ask for double. Like, go.
Add a 0.
Yes, you need all of that money and more. So go for it. Have no shame. And that's because the climb to sustainability is a really, really long one. And like, how long do you want to make it? Yeah. If you want to start with like very small startup grants, you're gonna make it a really, really long one, and you might never get there. Whereas if you can get a bit more upfront, then you're able to. And I think all of that would have enabled me to breathe. Yeah. And I didn't do much breathing in the 10 years that I was running the show. There was a good few years where I didn't take more than a few days off. Worked every weekend. Yeah. And on reflection, I don't think I didn't need to do that. Had I raised more money up front, I wouldn't have needed to do that. And kind of relates to that, I think, just brace yourself, because when you put yourself out there, I think particularly when you're doing something entrepreneurial and when it's socially motivated, people see that as license to give you all the feedback and critique that they desire. And
yes.
you're like, okay, great. I mean, I'm feeling desperately unsure of myself, but please give me everything you've got. And
the feedback, all the
feedback, love it.
Yeah.
So you have to like parse what you are given, identify the notes that you want to hold on to, and then identify those that you're going to disregard. But most of all, like, don't let it weigh on you when you lay your head down at night, which I often fail to do. So those would be my big ones.
Those are really good ones, especially that last one. I think, they all come down to trust yourself. And that's really hard when you make yourself vulnerable to start something, to lead something, to grow something. But, try to listen to the happy voices telling you can do this, and not the gremlins saying, what the hell are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap us up, we started with sort of the launch of Year Here and why you started it and what it did. And I know that you mentioned it closed its doors to new fellows, and that you're building this movement, which we know is really where social change is rooted, in movement and community. So what's next for Year Here? What's the plan?
Good question. So it is emerging.
Your elevator pitch in 30 minutes.
I do not have an elevator pitch. Do not ask me for that. No, it's very much emerging, and it's emerging in a very different vibe, first of all. So it's very much led by the fellows themselves. Mm-hmm. So I'm involved, and various other former staff members and former faculty members are involved, but it's led by the fellows, the 276 people who went through the program. And, when we close our doors, I was already here in New York, but it gave me an opportunity to reflect on. We actually launched at 10 Downing Street, which is very kind of weird, just do like a series of serendipitous connections. Yeah. We ended up launching at the Heart of Power in the UK. And the closure just had me thinking about how much had changed in that time. It had been 5 prime ministers in 10 years. There was the migrant crisis and Brexit in 2016, the Grenfell fire, I don't know if you heard of, in 2017, which is a really awful fire in a housing block that was not only a horrendous tragedy, but also revealed just how negligent the state had been with poor, mostly black and brown folks living in social housing. Then latterly, pandemic, the Black Lives Matter uprisings. So all that stuff, and quieter growing issues of rising homelessness and child poverty and the cost of living emergency. And so, when you compare that to whatever is that final statement on your theory of change about eradicate poverty and inequality in the UK, we very clearly failed. So just the mismatch between the grandiose statements of nonprofits and the reality, the brutal reality of life in the 21st century. So the need very clearly still there. And I don't want to be entirely pessimistic, because
on that note,
within that, I think our ventures and our fellows had begun to show folks, this is what you could do. This is what an alternate life could look like in terms of how we learn, how we live together, how we heal. And so I think that we just have this extraordinary sense of potential. It can't just end here. We've created something wonderful, but really is the very beginning of its, a long arc of impact and progress, I hope. And so in practical terms, we are working out what this new movement will do and will look like, but I think it's going to be about catalyzing and equipping the community with all the skills and connections they need to lead impact for many, many years and decades to come. I think also there's some exciting stuff to be done around collective impact. So a lot of our ventures work in similar fields. So quite a lot in working with migrants and refugees, others working with homeless people. And so looking at how we can forge partnerships between them to better support the people they work with. And then also I think advocacy. So we also have a dual structure. There's a company, social enterprise company, and a foundation, equivalent of a 501c3. And so the advocacy work is going to be kind of raising the alarm about the systemic inequality that is faced by social entrepreneurs from low income and underrepresented backgrounds, of which many of our fellows are. So there's all that. And then I think finally, we would also like to continue to be an inspiration, even though we are not offering new fellowships. And I really hope somebody else does that, because I think there is a real gap there. And the same gap that I identified 12 years ago still exists, sadly. But I think there are other ways that we can continue to inspire a new generation of social entrepreneurs to pursue this kind of route, but in a very year here way. So, which is starting with listening and learning, doing the kind of prototyping, testing and building that we've talked about. So whole lot of stuff there. It's going to emerge. Watch this space. It's going to be great.
I love everything about what you just said. I think it brings us full circle, right? We started off I wanted to do a deep dive with you into what does it actually look like on the ground? What does it mean to do social impact work, to grow a social impact movement or institution sustainably and strategically? And what you just talked about, this next phase for Year Here, I think is another meta example of what it looks like and what it means to do social impact work. It isn't one organization that exists for 50 years and has these outcomes. It is about collective action. It's about seeing how we can partner and find synergies. I think we're getting better as a society, as a sector here, and it sounds like in the UK, at thinking communally, at lifting up the lived experiences of leaders who have been impacted by the work they're doing. And I think you're speaking to something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the idea, it's why I named my company Bending Arc, right? This is the long game. It doesn't always it might seem in the short term like, wait, this failed, but actually we're bending the arc together.
Yeah.
And we'll see that over time. So I loved this conversation. I always love talking to you. This was such the perfect blend for me of the big picture and the nuts and bolts and the why and the personal. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation too. It's been great.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thanks so much for joining me this week. If you enjoy this podcast, I would love for you to leave a rating and a review. I read every single one and they really do matter. I also share extra tidbits and resources building on what we talk about here in my newsletter, Leadership Forward 321. You can sign up by texting the word impact to 66866. And finally, definitely check out the links and resources that I mentioned in this episode at brookericchiebabbage.com/podcast. See you next week.